Welcome to Creating Visual Content for Online Learning. In this module, we're going to work on actually developing and creating the content for online courses using the visual design principles that we've discussed so far in this workshop. Some of the challenge questions that we'll be dealing with in this particular module are how can we use visual materials to be effectively and integrated into online learning materials. Next, we're also going to look at how we go about creating visual diagrams and data visualizations that work in online courses. Many of us know that this is an emerging area in online learning and just the general internet and web. And so as online learning practitioners, we need to know how we go about creating analytical data visualizations that we can then put in our online courses. And then finally, we're going to look at how to minimize common visual design challenges associated with learning management systems. If we're delivering online courses, most, if not all of us, have dealt with a learning management system at some point, and many of us can identify that this can be a rather challenging aspect of dealing with online learning from a visual design standpoint. And so I'm going to present with you some ideas and ways that you could go about minimizing those challenges associated with using learning management systems. So before we get started, I really want to talk about kind of the technical specifications, and this is related to integrating the visual materials in online learning. So when we go about designing materials, it's not only important to have the design principles, but also do we have the technical aspects of things that we can actually use and put these in our online courses. And what I've done here is presented a diagram, a figure, if you will, that breaks down some common static image formats. And so we have JPEGs, GIFs, and PNGs. And so, and I've broken it down in terms of compatibility, background, and uses, so where you might use them. So for a JPEG, in terms of the compatibility, it's web ready. You can use this online. It's very common. Some of the background issues, it doesn't have a transparent background. So the image that you're going to have is going to be a constrained square or rectangle that you'll be using with. And these are most commonly used when dealing with photographs. Now, a GIF or .gif file is also web ready in terms of its compatibility. It does allow for transparent backgrounds where possible, but you're going to find that GIFs are of lower resolution than JPEGs. And so these are something that you would want to consider in terms of how you go about planning and using. These are commonly used for things like icons. You also see things like logos or very simple graphics. In large part, it just doesn't have as much data in the image file itself, so consequently it's a little bit less in terms of file size as well. And the final file type that I'd like to bring about is the .png, or PNGs is what sometimes they're called. And so from a compatibility standpoint, these are web ready, but they're web ready in newer browsers. So in most cases when students access this content, they're not going to have any problem whatsoever. In terms of the background, it allows for a transparent background. It is possible to do that. These are a little bit larger file size because they're containing more data. And you'll see these often used with complex graphics. So things like diagrams, things where there's a lot of detail that's needed, and you're dealing with transparent backgrounds and things like that. So this is kind of an overview of the common types of file formats that you're going to be dealing with when you're integrating visual materials in online learning aspects. And so that's a very important thing that you'll want to be aware of. A couple of other things that I want to point out when you're actually integrating visual materials in online learning, and this could be anywhere from a syllabus to a lesson materials to courseware, learning objects, things like that. Two things that you want to be aware of is how things are spaced on the screen and how they're organized. And so space deals with how closely related information is to one another. So for example, if we had an image that we were presenting in a lesson and I wanted to add a description to it, such as like a figure note, I would want to make sure that that figure note or description is close to the image that it's related to. This helps the learner integrate that information together. And the second aspect of organization is when we're integrating materials into learning management systems, most have a way of providing some sort of hierarchy. And when you're doing this, it's important to integrate visually the hierarchy of the lesson. So if you had a topic, maybe something that was underneath that would be a lesson. and maybe something underneath the lesson might be a did you know type learning object, something like that. And so as you start to go and begin organizing this information, the visual aspect of this is very important. And so we can look at visuals through what we actually put into the lesson, but also how those lessons are organized within the learning management system. So these aspects of things play an important role in how we go about integrating visual materials into learning management systems, and some important things to consider. So now let's talk a little bit about the actual content that we would place within learning management systems and actually go about creating this material. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is photography, and photography is one of the easiest but most challenging ways of incorporating visuals into online courses. From an easy standpoint, you can create your own photos for your courses just with a cell phone, with a camera-enabled cell phone. You can also use a camera, a point-and-shoot camera, things like that, all the way up to the DSLR cameras, which are the professional-grade cameras. And so from a photography standpoint, this is a great way of integrating visuals in your course. So first you would begin with your camera, obviously. You want to consider the lighting. So when you're taking pictures, is it lit well? Are you considering how those things are used? You also want to look at actually planning things out. You don't want to go out and just begin taking pictures. You really want to make sure the pictures that you're taking relate to the learning lesson that you're going to be presenting to your learners. Next step in that is to actually go and shoot the image, and so you're actually taking it and using the camera and taking the picture. Next, you'll be editing that, and we talked about Photoshop.com as a good free editor to use to go about editing that, and there's actually a demo of that in the online course site that you can review. And then finally, the production aspect of things, and this is where you actually go in and place the image within the online course site. And so production would be things like integrating into a lesson. So for example, one authoring tool is called SoftChalk that you may be aware of. So people can take an image or a photograph that they've created and actually build that into a SoftChalk lesson, so it creates a cohesive flow for the learners. So a couple of quality questions that I want to point out to you and things to consider is the photo produced correctly from a technical standpoint? So is it lit well? Is it in a format that can be used? And then also, does the photo represent the intended idea? If you have a photo that is completely unrelated to the lesson, this is going to hurt your learner more than it will help them. And then finally, does the photo aid in the learning process, which is what I just related to in terms of how that photo relates to what the end learning goal is for that particular lesson. So these are all important things that you want to consider when using photography in online courses. The next item I'd like to discuss is the use of graphics in online courses. Now, graphics are a great way of presenting concepts and ideas to learners in a way that's very efficient to create the materials that you'll actually use. And so graphic visuals are a great way of showing concepts, as I've mentioned, and it's also easy to produce through software that you may be very familiar with, such as things like PowerPoint. Now, this timeline or process flow here is actually an illustrative example of how you would go about creating graphics in online courses. Now, the first step into this is actually not any software related at all. First you want to do is grab a sketch pad or a piece of paper and actually draw out physically what you want the graphic to be like. So it could be a concept map, it could be a timeline, but the important thing is to draw it on paper because you can easily prototype and change it on paper. Once you have your concept on paper, then you can go into something like PowerPoint. And I recommend PowerPoint because it's easy to use. Many people are familiar with it. But before you really kind of get into it, the first thing you want to do is actually clean out the PowerPoint files. So I say is where you want to take out all the things related to the template or all the artifacts that PowerPoint puts there automatically for you. Because what we would be using is actually using the shapes within PowerPoint to create the various elements in the graphics. Now, I would caution you against using the things like the smart art that are automatically built into PowerPoint, just because they limit you in how to present your information visually through the graphics. Whereas if you're just using shapes, you can have a lot of flexibility in how those are presented. Next, you want to consider the format in which you are going to place it in. So again, this is obviously the size of the image, but also how it will be displayed to your learner. So it would be going back to the JPEG formats, or the PNGs, and things like that. And then the final step is to publish the image and use it in any sort of lesson or discussion board, however you plan to use it within your course. So there's a lot of different ways of using these graphics. So from some quality questions that you want to consider is, does the graphic accurately represent the intended ideas and or the relationships that you're trying to convey? And then second, is the graphic clearly viewed by the learner even when the small text is used? And I've seen this quite often. So for example, someone will create a graphic and then it doesn't quite fit in the lesson screen that they want, and so they begin resizing it just by dragging the corners of the graphics in their lesson authoring tool. Now what this does, it doesn't do anything in terms of shrinking the image. You're still loading the same image, but it's shrunk in terms of how it's being presented. So it often distorts the image and makes it very difficult to read, especially if the text on that graphic is small. And then finally, you want to consider if the graphic is free of any resizing or conversion artifacts, which is kind of what I just mentioned is what leads to those sort of things. So these are all important quality questions that you'll want to think about when you're designing graphics. One of the best resources for using PowerPoint to create graphics is the Rapid eLearning blog by Articulate. And this has a lot of tutorials, a lot of templates and examples that you can draw from and use. And you'll see actually a couple resources within this workshop that I've linked you to start considering that use. So graphics are a great way of presenting ideas and concepts. Now, the final category that I want to present to you is the use of analytical design. And so analytical design is the process of using data to present ideas and concepts. And so this could be as easily as a chart or table or graph, something like that, or as complex as a really integrated visual that has a lot of multivariate data associated with it. Now these are taken from probably the leading expert and authority on analytical design and the presentation of data visually. Is named Edward Tufte, and this is from a book called Beautiful Evidence. And if you're looking for a great resource on this, Beautiful Evidence is a wonderful and phenomenal book that it should probably be on your shelf. And so analytical design, he presents really 6 principles of analytical design, and these are to show comparisons and contrasts and differences, so show causality, a mechanism, explanation, and semantic structure of what you're presenting. Third is to show multivariate data, that is how more than one or two variables are related. And you want to completely integrate words, numbers, images, and diagrams. So we talked about this in terms of how we go about presenting slides, and so we want to try to integrate on a single slide as much as possible. We also want to thoroughly describe the evidence or the data that's being presented within the particular visual. So these would be things like a footnote and saying where it's coming from, what are the characteristics of the data, who was sampled, things like that. Because the more of that information you can provide related to the data source, the more useful that data will be for your learners. And then finally, and I believe this is one of the most important things, is that analytical presentations ultimately stand or fall depending on the quality, relevance, and integrity of their content. So it's not the actual visual that you're creating, but it's rather how you present that data through the lens of the visual material, visual information. So this is an important factor to consider, and these are wonderful principles to look at in terms of how you go about presenting analytical data or quantitative data in courses. Now, so the process that you would go about to create analytical data visualizations would be, first of all, to examine the data. You have to be very well aware of what it is and how it works and what's going on within that data. That's very independent from the visual presentation of it, as we'll find. Next, we want to determine the method. So you're asking your question, what is the best method to go about visualizing this data? And Tufte actually uses the comment, whatever it takes. And that's an important theme throughout presenting data in visuals. Now we're ready to visualize the data. So we're looking at the visual data in terms of how we're going to present it, things of that nature. Then we have to actually go and clean the presentation. So if we're using things like Microsoft Excel or SPSS, things of that nature, you'll know that it actually creates a lot of what Tufte calls chart junk around the data. And this is where we go in and clean it and actually make it so that it's palatable and presentable to learners. And then finally, we're ready to publish it and actually use that data within our course. And how that is being used is can be in many different ways, but you obviously want to maintain the integrity of the data and the description around what makes that data useful. So in terms of some of the quality questions that you'll want to be concerned with when doing analytical design is, does the visual lie to anyone? And this is kind of a harsh statement, but it's very easy to lie to people through the misuse of the visual data. So is it accurately represented to the learner? One of the worst strategies that people will use are the use of 3D visualizations within the data. And essentially what this does is it skews the visual presentation of the data in a way that actually essentially lies to the learner, where they can't get a good idea of the relationships between the data that are being presented. And then we're looking at how much of the visual is data and how much is junk. And so you can look in terms of how much is the lines being put in a chart or graph, how much is the color that's being placed there. All that is junk, really, because it's not data. So you want to look at in terms of making sure that you emphasize the data in those visuals. And does the visual spark an action? So what are you going to do with this information? And data should be the basis for good decision making. And so if you can't glean an idea of what the learner should be doing based on that data, you probably should go back to the drawing board in terms of how you're presenting that information, and maybe even going back to the data and looking at, is this really meaningful? Should I be presenting it in this way to the learner? So these are some key considerations for analytical design. Now, as we kind of complete, I want to bring some ideas in terms of how we work with LMSs, because we all know that both the photographic, graphical, and analytical design can be wonderful, but if we can't get it into the LMS, we're going to be facing some serious problems. And so learning management systems, they represent one of the largest and yet unavoidable challenges associated with visual design and online learning, in large part because they have their own visual design approach, and there's not much that we can do to actually change that approach. And so we oftentimes we could develop something from scratch. We might be able to address that, but that's often not the case, not the option that we have available to us. So some steps that you would want to take when you go about designing visual information within learning management systems and presenting visual information. The first thing is, to the greatest extent possible, remove any unnecessary information. And this is really putting the learner first in that process in terms of, if you're not using the features within an LMS, remove those. If you're not using screens within an LMS, restrict access to those. So minimizing any of the extraneous information that learners could come across is going to be a really key element in terms of helping them succeed in the course through the use of visual information. The second thing is really to think about screen size. Now, those of us know that our courses are being delivered on multiple formats, multiple screen sizes, anywhere from a very small mobile device or a smartphone to very large screens and presentation monitors. And so these present a rather important challenges from visual designers in online courses, because we have to consider the learners not only that are taking the course from a smartphone, but also them that are going to be on a desktop or something of that nature, or even tablet devices. And so the screen size is important, and thinking of things like responsive design, or designing HTML pages so that they can respond to the size of the screen that they're being presented in, are important elements that we'd want to at least consider in a design process. Use and reuse templates. One of the most important things that people will come across when they start assessing the professional nature of a course is the consistency. So how consistent is the visual theme represented throughout the entire course? And one of the best ways to do this is through the use of templates and to reuse those templates. Now, this may be more of an interaction design aspect, but it plays into the visual design process as well, is to try to minimize the clicks that the learner must go through in order to access information. This goes back to Tufte in the analytical design, is try to integrate as much as possible onto a single screen, or a single piece of paper, or a single a visual plane. And by minimizing those clicks, that really helps the learner to see how all these pieces are related. And most importantly, if you take nothing else from this workshop, is remember that all visuals in online courses should have purpose, and they should be there for a reason. And so if you're finding that you're putting in images of people that are smiling, having a good time, but they really don't relate much to the lesson as it stands, then you probably need to reconsider is if that visual is a necessarily part of the learning process, because visual design is all about solving problems, and since we're dealing with this in online learning, it's about solving online learning problems. And this kind of takes us full circle in terms of saying that visuals really should have purpose and they should be intentional when we go about including them in our courses. So from a summary standpoint, we looked at these three questions about how we integrate visuals in online learning materials. We looked at how to build data visualizations and the different flavors of visuals, if you will, and we looked at the processes for creating those. And then finally we looked at how we minimize some visual design challenges with using learning management systems. And we know that these can be important challenges, but using some of those strategies, we can overcome them and really make our online learning environments visually interesting and compelling and engaging for our learners. And that the positive use of visual design can really enhance the learning environment for our learners. So in terms of our next steps in moving forward from this module, this workshop in its entirety and these modules in particular are a beginning and reference point for moving forward. The development of visual design strategies and techniques can take a long time to develop fully and to really begin using and practicing these things. And so you've had the opportunity through the design challenges within this workshop to begin critically practicing these things, but visual design is really developed through practice and practical application. And I would encourage you to begin creating visuals, using them and integrating them in your online courses, and then seeking feedback from students. And so as they begin looking at it, ask them, what was helpful about this? What was not helpful? What could be done differently to make this a useful learning tool for you? And so I'd like to encourage you to place what you're developing in this workshop as a beginning and reference point and begin actually using that in practice. And I think that you'll find through that process of application of these pieces of knowledge and skills, through that you will begin developing the skills that are really necessary to be exemplary and an expert visual designer within online learning. So I encourage you to do that. I've enjoyed the workshop. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, comments, or concerns as you complete the workshop and even beyond.